as we now start to look at what Rule 501 gives us, because there's nothing in the rule itself, we're looking elsewhere to determine whether a privilege exists. The first thing you're going to want to ask is the most easy in many ways. Is there a statute? Like there's a statute under Pennsylvania, or in Pennsylvania, there's a statute relating to the doctor-patient privilege. It's right there. And that statute will lay out whether the privilege exists. There are also then, if there's not a statutory privilege that exists, we move to the next level. Is there a common law privilege? Have courts forever said, as they have, that there is a spousal privilege? Now, what the spousal privilege exactly means will vary from some states to the federal rule, and that we'll raise that at the end of this little video. Who is the holder of the privilege? But there is a spousal privilege of some sort in every jurisdiction. Things that couples say to each other in the privacy of their own homes that are they're protected in some way, and this will vary depending on who the holder of the privilege is. But we'll get to that. Priest penitent, psychotherapist patient. These are all things that are either statutory or common law protections that exist. There's a possibility for new and emerging protections to exist based on policy arguments. This is the most difficult one to show, but you can in fact try to argue for a new privilege for some sort of a privileged communication, a private communication that you claim should be privileged, based on an argument that there is a policy that supports it. That's going to be your absolute weakest argument. Your first hope is that there's a statute that very clearly lays it out. Your second hope is that judges have recognized historically that these types of communications are in fact privileges, and can only be waived for certain provisions that would relate to would permit that sort of waiver, and we'll get to those. So then, once we've established that there is a privilege, what's the scope of this privilege? First of all, was the communication one that was between the parties who are subject to it? So, if you bring your lawyer to your confession, there was a joke about this. I think Bill Maher said that one of his parents was Catholic, the other one was Jewish, and that he always brought a lawyer to confession, which I thought was just a really, really funny joke. But if you do that, if you bring another person to an otherwise privileged communication, if you bring a police officer to a communication with your wife, then that no longer is a privileged communication between two parties that are subject to the privilege. It's been opened up to other people. It has been disclosed to someone else. What if one of the parties sues the other? So let's say it's a lawyer-client privilege. You can't say anything about what your client told you under normal circumstances. If your client sues you or if you sue your client for an unpaid bill, or if your client sues you claiming you were an ineffective lawyer, or sues you for malpractice, then all of a sudden those things that were otherwise privileged have been waived by the nature of this lawsuit. And then our final question that I kind of teed up earlier: who is the holder of this privilege? And this comes up most often in the marital context. Because it's just one of the frequent things in criminal cases that the prosecution wants. It's usually the wife to testify against the husband in a criminal case, and under federal law, which we'll get to under a case called Trammell, if the non-defendant spouse, it's statistically usually the wife, so it's easier to say that way. If the wife doesn't want to testify against the husband, she doesn't have to under Trammell. Under any state, if the wife doesn't want to testify against her husband, she doesn't have to in a criminal or civil case. What if she wants to? What if it's part of a deal? Or what if she just desires to testify? That will vary depending on whether we are in a jurisdiction that follows the federal rule or in a jurisdiction that says that both spouses are the holders of the privilege. So if it's the spouse who is testifying who holds the privilege. In other words, if it's the spouse who is testifying against the other spouse, if it's the wife testifying against the husband, if it's the testifying spouse's privilege, then he or she can decide, I am going to testify or I'm not. And if she says, I'm not testifying, the government can't make her. But if both parties hold this privilege, then the defendant can actually prevent the other spouse from testifying. So, so let's say, that you have a criminal case that the prosecution wants the wife to testify against the husband. In a non-federal jurisdiction that follows the opposite rule from the feds, the husband can say, I hereby prevent her from testifying because she is my spouse, and everything that she knows about this matter is the subject of a privileged conversation between just the two of us. In a jurisdiction that doesn't follow the federal rule on this and allows both spouses to be the holders of the privilege, not just the testifying spouse, then in that case, the testimony is precluded. So you have to ask this fundamental question. If a person wishes to testify, if your priest wishes to testify against you, if your doctor wishes to testify against you, you want to look at the case law and ask, is it the doctor or is it the patient who can prevent the testimony? If it's the doctor and he wants to testify or she wants to testify, that's going to happen. If it's the patient who's the holder of the privilege, then the doctor is not permitted to testify if the patient refuses to allow it. So one of the key questions to always ask here is, who is the holder of the privilege? Who has the right to prevent this testimony from going forward? Is it the person who would be testifying or the person who would be testified against? So that provides you a nice outline, and this is in the charter course. It's all written out. This provides you a nice outline for how to think about privileges.